Welcome to part 6. In this part, we're going to assemble the tilt switch and write the code to make it work. Here are the parts that we'll need to build our tilt switch. It's everything that we've used so far. Our tilt switch will contain an LED that's going to be turned on and off. And then in addition, we'll need to add our tilt sensor and a couple more wires. Here's what the tilt sensor looks like. It's basically a small black canister with a metal end and 2 pins coming out of it. And here's a diagram or a conceptual diagram of what you would find inside of it if you cut it in half. Basically, it has leads coming into it, so there are 2 pins, and I'm representing the pins with these red lines. And then inside the can is a little ball, and the ball's metal. And when the can is straight up, the ball is resting at the bottom of the can, and it's creating a contact between the 2 pins. And then when you tilt the can over, like in this diagram, the ball will fall out of the circle at the bottom, breaking the contact between the 2 pins. In essence, it's just a little ball and 2 wires. When it's sitting upright, the current can flow through the wires, the ball, and the wires. When it's tilted to the side, the current can't flow through the ball because the ball has fallen away from the contacts. Let's go ahead and build our circuit. Here we're looking at our breadboard and our Arduino, and I have set aside an LED, a resistor, and our tilt switch. Let's begin by building the light portion of our tilt sensor or tilt switch by adding the LED. And then I'm going to take a single line from ground and run it to the blue bar. And that will give me a ground line. Let's turn that wire black. And now I'm going to add a resistor and go from the blue bar up to the negative pin of my LED. And again, a reminder, the negative pin is the short pin and the positive pin is the long pin. We're going to drive the LED with digital output pin number 7. So as before, I'm going to take a line and go from pin 7 to the positive pin of my LED. We'll go ahead and make that one red. So I now have the light portion of my switch completed. The next thing that I need to do is add the tilt switch. So let's go ahead and bring him in here. And I'm going to put one of the legs to ground. So I'll just draw a wire there, and they always come in the wrong color for me. So we now have a wire going from one leg of the tilt sensor to ground. I'm going to take another wire and go from pin 2 of my Arduino to the other leg of the tilt sensor. And I'm going to make this a totally different color. Let's make it green. To symbolize that it's neither positive or negative, it could be either, depending on the position of our tilt switch. Here is a picture of my circuit all set up, and if you want to pause the video at this point and keep that circuit up so you can see it, and then go ahead and build your circuit. Now our board is put together, and we can start writing the program. Before we start coding, we should have a plan. Here is the plan for how to make our tilt sensor work. Notice that I have things broken into 3 sections this time. I have the setup like you were expecting from the last program. I have loop like you were expecting from last program. But I also have one line of code that's outside both of those sections, and that's the introduction of my variable. If that happens outside of setup and loop, it becomes a variable that's accessible to everything in my program. And that's called a global variable. Let's go ahead and walk through this. So we're going to start with introduce a variable named tilt. I'm doing this outside of both setup and loop. Inside of setup, I'm going to create pin number 7, which is what we've been using already, and I'm going to set it as output and then turn it off. I'm also going to set up pin 2 as an input pin, and then I'm going to set that pin high, and it's part of how our sensor is going to work, but as long as pin 2 has current flowing from pin 2 to ground, it will read as low, meaning it's touching low. If I cut the line from pin 2 to ground, then because it's pulled high, it will show up as high, and that will tell us that the board is tilted and that the ball has fallen off of the two contacts inside the tilt switch. So we'll know that that has happened if pin 2 is high. In loop, it gets simpler. We're going to check our sensor and then put the value that's found in the sensor into our variable named tilt. Then we'll check tilt, and if it's 1, that means that the board has been tilted, and we'll turn on the light. Otherwise, we'll turn off the light. And finally, we'll put in a delay for just 100 milliseconds or so that it has time to react. Let's go ahead and open the Arduino Studio so that we can start typing our code. So here's my Arduino Studio. I'm going to do File New and then close the old one. And right away, I'm going to save it. So File, Save As, and I'll call this Tilt Switch. Also, before we get too far along, I'm going to go ahead and plug in my Arduino. And then I'm going to do Tools and Port, and just make sure that it senses the Arduino and sees it. Everything's good to go. We can start coding. So based on our plan, before we did setup or loop, we were going to introduce that variable. So I positioned my insertion point or my cursor in front of void setup and then hit enter a couple of times. And now I'm going to type int and the name of my variable, which is tilt, and we can set it to 0 if you wish to start. It'll get reset when we go into the loop, so that will be fine. Done with part 1. In the setup section, and I'll go ahead and delete that comment and indent. Let's start with pin 7, which is our output pin, and we need to set the mode of that to output. So we're going to say pin mode, and then pin mode requires the number of the pin and the mode, which will be output, and the semicolon. Let's go ahead and set up our pin 2 as well, and pin 2 is going to be input. For pin 7, we're going to be sending a signal out on it. For pin 2, we're going to be reading it to see what the signal is. I'm going to turn off the LED on pin 7 right after we set it up. So I will do a digital write to 7 and set it to low, and that'll turn the LED off. And then we also need to pull pin 2 to high so that when there's a connection to ground, it'll look or appear to be low, and when there's no connection to ground, it will appear to be high. So digital write to high. And that takes care of our setup section. In the loop, we need to first check the value of our digital pin to see if it's low or high. And we use digital write to change the value. We use digital read to read a pin. I'm going to say my variable tilt is equal to whatever I get when I digital read pin 7 or pin 2. And now when this line is done, the value on pin 2 is going to be in tilt. So if pin 2 is low, meaning there's current going from pin 2 to ground, then it will be a 0. If it's high, no current, that means it's tilted, and tilt will be a 1. We're ready for our if statement. Remember, we start with if, and then we have a condition in parentheses. So our condition in this case is if tilt is equal 1. If that's the case, go ahead and open a brace for a new code block. We're going to digital write to pin 7 and turn it high. And then otherwise, we're going to digital write to pin 7 and turn it low. The last thing we need to do is we're going to delay for 100 milliseconds. So here is my code. It's ready to go, and I'm going to give you a chance to pause your video and run your code or check your code and make sure it's correct. Don't forget, when you're ready to check your code, you can press the little check mark and it will pre-compile for you, and if nothing shows up red down here in the bottom, then everything should be good to go. When everything is done and it's good to go, you can push your upload button, and that will send, it'll recompile your code and send it to the Arduino, and then you can test it by turning your board sideways to see if your LED lights up. Go ahead and pause the video and get your code written and tested. If you have problems, check with your instructor. Well, congratulations, you made it to the end. But if this was fun for you, this isn't really the end, because the sky is the limit. If you can visualize something that you might want to do with an Arduino, you can probably find a way to get it done. As an example, my next project is going to be an automated hydroponic garden where different sensors will sense the amount of moisture in the soil, and then the Arduino, based on those sensors, will trigger relays that will turn on pumps to hydrate the soil if it's starting to get dry. If you want to do more, you have a couple of options. One is you can just Google Arduino and or watch YouTube tutorials, thousands of tutorials out there, both written tutorials that you can read through or video tutorials if you prefer those. In addition, there are lots of books online that you can read, and lots of different sensors, motors, relays, and things like that that you can buy very reasonably online. Thanks for sticking with me through this whole tutorial, and my hope is that having gone through this, that you have a better understanding of both how computers work and also how they can interact with the real world.